move it forward, or is it in the brain? There is an AI organ or a language organ that we are born with innate intelligence. And so, as I was just telling Sunandan, who was a graduate student at NYU, um, I was describing a game that I had become interested in to understand biology. These are called signaling games. And we had published a paper in PNAS, or the Journal of the Royal Society, about a classical biological problem called codon evolution. How did the RNA world change to a DNA world? They change with a language called codons and anticodons, and they communicate with each other. But they can be deceptive, or they can be attacked by other deceptive agents such as mRNA viruses like COVID virus. So the next question was, is the natural language something similar? So we started thinking about natural language processing as a game, and quickly realized that other people had thought about that. So one game called the language game was described by Wittgenstein in his Tractatus. Um, that's related. So there we have information, either innate or adaptive. We work in society to combine that information to come up with more interesting social behavior. Then the next thing is that the social behavior in the game we play, is it information symmetric or information asymmetric? Do we all have same information or structure when we are born, or we acquire them? And that brings up the idea of imitation game from Alan Turing, where we can imitate each other and change our behavior. And usually we do that in a trusted way, in a eusocial cooperative breeding structure called extended family. It's multi-generational. It has a grandmother, has father, mother, and children, and we communicate information accurately and correctly. We don't deceive each other in the society, extended family. But then, as we go to structures like societies, villages, and urban areas, we can't figure out how to trust each other, how to communicate, and come up with common knowledge, common sense knowledge. And we could be deceptive. We could pretend to be something that's bigger than just language game or imitation game. And those are called signaling games, information asymmetric games. So this idea goes back to Heraclitus, who assumed that we are born with idios cosmos, or our own knowledge structure. May have a grandmother cell, we may have a place cell, we may have a deceptive cell in our neuronal brain structure. But we learn quickly to combine information from others and come to a Aquinas cosmos, common sense. But if we write down our signals, our text in English, our natural language, we could easily imagine automating that and have bots or AIs doing Aquinas cosmos from idios cosmos. And that became apparent more recently when we had crossed the threshold of amount of data and threshold of computing power to be able to create transformer-based, multi-attention-based, generative pre-trained transformer structures and get enamored by it. So the GPT allows us to do language games, but at the level of tokens. GPT allows us to do imitation games. It can plagiarize, it can be stochastic parrot, it can be anything pretentious that we want it to be, but it can also hallucinate. So the signaling game says that the language structure should not be treated as ground truth, but as a signaling game. And it can have many stable Nash equilibria. And one of them is called a pooling equilibria, where we can't distinguish between human and a bot and pass the Turing test. But that has problematic risks for AI. But if we do costly signaling games where every bot or a human has an identity based on a complex one-way function, and there's a way to evaluate or separate good intelligence from deceptive intelligence, then that results in signaling game equilibria called separating equilibria. And that's what we aim to get. But the separating equilibria could be very, very expensive, right? So, but humans have been doing that with institutions, with regulations, with religions, with logos and laws and languages and oaths and mantras and yin and yang and zunzis. So we have been creating this technology for ever since the axial period, since Buddha and Confucius and Socrates and others. So what does it mean to introduce costly signaling in an automated way to that structure? Where will it end up? So that's what we're going to talk about today. And I had picked Sunandan because he's been very interested in linguistics. He was actually somebody who read a book by Parthan Yogi, an NLP scientist who died prematurely. And that book influenced him and through him, me. And that resulted in the idea of creolizing the web. So I hope he'll talk a bit about it. He's a professor at Purdue, Indiana University. He just became an associate professor. So I hope he'll have time to follow up on Wittgenstein and Parthan Yogi and all the others who have been thinking about computational theory of languages. And how would creolization avoid costly signaling as well as AI risk? You don't want to be too expensive, but you don't want it to be also risky and create negative structures for the society. So again, the same thing comes up with Voice of Us, who is a mentee, almost like a student, graduate student, and he has been interested in AI doing costly signaling through reasoning and smart contracts, but keep the cost low. So there is no hard fork, and each hard fork doesn't mean that somebody will become billionaire and subsequently go to jail for 40 years. But some structure that understands the language and creates the interactions correctly among them. So you don't put guardrails, you don't put reinforcement with human learning. You let the system itself learn the social structure and how to organize it. So how costly can that signaling be, and how deceptive can it become? And then I had asked Petrina Kammer to join us, but unfortunately she got called by another meeting. She's not here. She works with another mentee of mine, Alex Zavarankov, for a company called InSilico. and they have been using AI to design drugs. They were in the news for a drug for idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. And I believe AI would play a big role in drug discovery and chemistry, and both chemistry and disease markers can be pulled together to come up with drugs for aging, neurodegeneration, and cancer cheaply. But it will require costly signaling, which will involve clinical trials, massive amount of data analysis, and reorganizing the chemistry so that it depends on the structures that we understand in chemistry or building blocks or click chemistry, things like that. So I believe that we will come up with interesting drugs without making the drugs uh, unnecessarily expensive um, through cold chain or mRNA, etc. But uh, but succeed in getting good separating equilibria. And our fourth panel is so the so the clinical trials and chemistry-based analysis has to be joined with generative AI that we are finally coming up with. And last but not least is Yaro Izu. She is the editor of IJIR, and she contacted me. I don't know why. Maybe because of my earlier work in robotics, which will involve grasping and non-holonomic motion planning and control theory and geometry. But as far as I can tell, not much AI. She contacted me, and I thought she would be a good panelist where she can discuss how they have been using AI to design autonomous systems underwater, on the surface, in space, or air. So these are driverless cars, drones, space probes, underwater bots. And some are holonomic, some are non-holonomic, but there is non-holonomy almost in everything, and that makes the robot localization problem very hard. So a robot often loses track of where it is and depends on external things like LiDAR and radar and GPS, etc., to relocate itself. But once it does that, it is context dependent. It's actually depends on the society, where they put the GPS, where they put the triangulation, etc. So we have a local library. When I go there, the door says, in case of emergency, open it manually. That has no physics. It's a linguistic structure that the robot has to understand and act. So you can imagine the costly signaling comes from this kind of labeling. A doorknob actually tells how it's actuated and guides the planning. So the plan is in the world itself. So we have a computational linguist, a computational social scientist, or who looks at smart contracts and social conventions and taboos and things like that. We hope we'll have a computational chemist who is using AI with success, and a computational physicist who is using robotics. So now I'm thinking that this series of webinars should be not a pessimistic existential threat kind of structure, but more like how we thought about it and how we got into good structures using physics, chemistry, social science, or linguistics. Does that make sense? So we will keep the discussion optimistic.
Yeah, that sounds great, Bud, and thank you for the very long introduction. I think it's amazing that you were able to give that kind of exposition. Yeah, so from beginning to end, covering the paper that we're also considering, which I think deserves a little bit of mention. So, yeah, this paper it's called AI Thinking Machines in a Vast Active Living Intelligent System. I'm curious to hear what the other panelists think about that paper. I've got some immediate like gut reactions to it, but maybe I'll hold off. Um,
No, go ahead.
oh, you want me to just start, go for it? Okay. Um,
Yeah,
it's
yeah. But by the way,
I,
that paper was written while I was on vacation in Paris. So there were long walks, and it just wrote itself.
it,
And yeah,
it's a lovely paper, and I think that
it's very mystical, though. Okay,
it's
so
mystical. I think one of the things that might be lost on people who haven't read Wittgenstein, haven't read the Tractatus, is that it is stylistically emulating the Tractatus. Now, of course, but I know you well, and so one of the questions is why would you imitate the Tractatus? Or I know that amongst the things that you love about Wittgenstein, you're more like a post Blue Book kind of guy. So you're not the early
yeah,
Tractatus Wittgenstein kind of guy. You're a later Wittgenstein language games kind of guy. But to emulate this
yeah,
style, I think it has a deep meaning. And I think it would be great to just talk about that. And I believe that in the last section of the paper, in the conclusion, you've got some text that helps the reader understand that framing. But I don't think it's evident to people who aren't familiar with Wittgenstein himself and his own career. The early Wittgenstein wrote the Tractatus. I think it was 1921 or something like that. And he thought
during World War One. It
yeah,
was written when he was a soldier on the France, World
uh,
War One, and he carried it in his backpack everywhere. So it had mugs and blood and everything. Uh,
but when he published it, he thought it was
right.
effectively the end of philosophy, that he had
Yes.
effectively solved philosophy. But after many years of rumination, he realized, no, this is not the way. And I think that the intent of this paper is to kind of, in some grand synthesis, put out your own ideas so that they can become some kind of new beginning to rejecting this paper and coming up with more nuanced ideas. And
Yeah.
anybody who reads this paper, you should be aware of that. Don't just go into it and think, okay, what is this babble? This is a beginning for you to eventually come and critique the paper itself. So
Yeah.
I love that about its style.
Yeah. The I try to plagiarize and mimic Wittgenstein because I was stuck. I was invited by ZRE to write a paper, opinion paper, and to focus on AI risk. And I understood the games and how to describe the game, but I was getting confused. I was totally confused, thinking that there is going to be some kind of logical inconsistency, so that ultimately it'll fall apart. The idea that there's a game, um, and it's still there. I mean, how do we give agency to a bot? Are they being built by Hintons and Altman and others, or they are naturally arising out of the process of creating Moore's law, making computers faster and faster, and combining large amount of data? In fact, it was so hungry for data, it violated copyright laws, scraped YouTube and verbal data into linguistic data and use annotator, and also the hardware. Moore's law got a kick from Nintendo, sorry, NVIDIA and Intel and the chip war and all that. So in some sense, the agency that the AI is getting is a natural agency. It's getting on its own, but that creates confusion because how do you distinguish between humans and bots? It's not clear that somehow because there are bots, humans will stop plagiarizing or violating copyright laws. So it was confusing to distinguish between a human and a bot. So the solution was to both copy the philosophy and the style of Wittgenstein, to moor it into a thing that, because of its style, is naturally consistent. And he starts with 7 axioms. And one of the interesting thing about Wittgenstein's approach is he defines 2 propositions, which he calls graphical propositions. And these propositions were assumed by the Greeks to be idealized propositions, and we work with some approximation of it. That's very Platonic. And Russell thought, and also a lot of the Vienna Circle people thought that the propositions come from our sense organs. So we know the world is as things, proposition true or false, because our sense organs tell us. So we think volume and temperature and pressure are more realistic than molecules that are bombarding each other in a Brownian motion. And Boltzmann and Ernst Mach kept debating until Einstein showed through his paper on Brownian motion that molecular thinking is actually true, and you can create propositions that can be at the level of molecules, at the level of quantum mechanics, and the world still continues. And Wittgenstein didn't go after those propositions. He assumed that there is a world, and world has facts. And we don't know the facts. We have no way of knowing the facts. But we have thoughts, and we combine those thoughts to get something, get propositions. But thoughts themselves are hidden. There's an information asymmetric structure, and we combine our thoughts. So I thought the language and the structure and the style was appropriate for Wittgenstein to comment on AI. So I used that in order not to avoid making mistakes, but also I wanted to throw in the biological example of mitochondrial endosymbiosis and going back and forth between mitochondria and humans or eukaryotes and AI required that somehow structurally they should fit together. So the style was intentionally mimicked. Yeah, but there was no World War I, so I did not carry it in my backpack.
Yeah, and I know you originally published it under a little bit of a pseudonym, which is that anagram Mad Hubris, and I think that also reveals a little bit of the style of the paper.
Yeah, and there is also a clear influence from Philip Dick.
Yes,
exegesis. So because they all had thought about these questions, Philip Dick is not Wittgenstein, so it's not structurally as clear. And I think Philip Dick was smoking a bunch of things, so he could go on with the style.
But he was,
and they're both mystical. The exegesis and Tractatus are both mystical.
Yeah.
So it was hard to make sure that I was getting my ideas across. But
I think Philip Dick was also very interested in, Heraclitus's idea of the
Yeah.
Iliocosmos and the
Yes.
Kinos cosmos. This idea that I
Right.
have this internal world that when I go to sleep, I'm the only person who really knows about it. But then I wake up and here I am in this common world.
Right.
And
Right.
how to reconcile this dual existence in this internal world and external world. And you bring it out over here pretty well. So, but I think the magic of the paper is you weave all these things with formal fields of study, for instance, signaling games, et cetera. And I think it's not this anachronistic attempt to bring us back to logical positivism or verificationism.
Yeah.
It's this idea of, hey, look, we have so many other apparatuses right now. If we synthesize all of them, we get something really interesting. Let's take a look. Let's take a look.
Right. Yeah. There's also another thing that the paper doesn't show. It got me really interested in endosymbiosis, especially mitochondrial endosymbiosis, which happened 2 billion years ago. And just last week, science had a new organism called Leucine A, which has endosymbiosis with mitochondria, chloroplasts, nitroplasts. So it can create respiratory chain energy through mitochondria. It can do photosynthesis through chloroplasts, and it can do nitrogen fixation and make ammonia through nitroplasts. And I don't think biologists understand, or at least I don't understand why they are so stable. So the paper was an attempt to understand um, the mechanisms that biology used to create complicated structures like us, eukaryotes with dendrites and axons and dopamines and all that. And the style, the Wittgenstein did not think of himself as a biologist. Wittgenstein's style was much more useful than anything. I mean, maybe Crick went along that way also through a central dogma of biology and information flow, which is a very abstract concept, which is saying biology is not going to get the facts of the world, but can get information and information flow. And actually, those ideas came from computer science through a Italian Danish scientist, Niels Baricelli, who used ENIAC to create artificial life. But unfortunately for us, von Neumann kicked him out of Institute of Advanced Studies and took over. And that's where we get self-reproducing automata. A lot of ideas about robotics came from Wittgenstein and computers, von Neumann, not Wittgenstein, von Neumann's architecture and his understanding of self-reproducing automata and artificial life is important. And Sidney Brenner took it back to biology. And so the terminology like transcription, translation are not a biological terminology. It is actually an engineering terminology that came from Baricelli. And Brenner influenced Crick, and Crick's codon evolution, central dogma, etc., came from Baricelli. So, and I think the biology will be probably just as important as AI, because drug discovery, controlling mitophagy and apoptosis through genome instability could be a big thing for biology, at least translational biology. So, and the paper may not be recognizable, but he's trying to appeal to biologists to go back and think about these things. So it could survive as a biology paper.
Yeah, actually, I like the idea you mentioned in the paper. So I would rather call it as biological inspired AI.
Yes.
Yeah, that's the way I like it. Because
Yeah, and
I always thinking, you know, how could we create a inclusive environment for human beings and AI and robots? I mean, in the future. So I think one way is analysis of human societies. So
yeah,
one of my research area was social mobile robotics. So which is specifically based on social codes of human societies. So we were transferred them to the mobile robots just for human robot coexisting environments. So I can introduce a little bit about
yeah,
this research we have done. So traditionally for a mobile robot, surround people were always treated as obstacles.
right,
Yeah, so when the mobile robot met a person, or saw a person, and the robot will consider it as obstacles, so they avoid the person, and then they avoid the person, or they just stay there until the person pass by. So but we think that's very inefficient mobility. Sometimes even especially in very crowded environments, misfunctions always happen because the robot cannot go forward because it's surrounded by many people. So the robot think, okay, my surroundings are all obstacles, so I can't go. I just stay here. So that's the problem. So I think we need a new mobile robot with more advanced intelligence, like in perception, localization, and decision making. So if we go back to the early stage of artificial intelligence, we always use expert system, right? So the expert system were used to emulate the decision-making ability of a human expert. So that was the very early stage. But later, we go to learning world. So then we propose, so in 2020, we proposed the concept social mobile robotics, which means a mobile robot should have ability to learn from the group behaviors of the surrounding people. So not just learn from some specific experts, so-called experts. So the mobile robot should have ability to learn from arbitrary group of people surrounding it, right?
right,
Yeah. So that's what we did. So in that research, we use like a reward function. So the reward function was conforming to social codes. For example, it depends on where you are. For example, okay, walk on the right side, or pass on the left side, or make a detour if you're behind a person. So that's some simple social codes when people walk with other persons, right? So we ask the robot to learn those social codes. So then if the robot meets crowded people, then it has ability to make the right decision for more efficient mobility. So that's one thing we did. But later I talked to Bud, and then I found the linguistic is very wonderful. So we the first time we talk about from linguistic to AI, right? So
Yeah.
that was about the previous paper.
Right.
Yeah. We talk about. So yeah. So that inspired me. I think it's a very good idea. Because you know, according to Wittgenstein's statement, the limit of language means limit of word. So I think it's a very natural way to design a trusted AI system based on linguistics. And also,
Anybody wants to? Yeah.
go ahead.
I was just opening up to the other panelists.
Yeah, so let me just pitch in here. Yeah, I like the way you like introduced linguistics, and while you were speaking about robots and how humans and robots can interact with each other seamlessly, I was also thinking how linguistic systems can do the same. And so now, to some extent, AI and generative AI and AI have become synonymous. Like when we a layperson is thinking about AI, they think about large language models. So a good amount of emphasis currently on AI-related research is on around this whole emerging idea of large language models, right? And so there are so many issues. And one thing is whatever it's producing, it can have biases, and what it will produce. So I'm talking about how like the interaction between humans and AI in terms via this kind of linguistic platforms can be made more inclusive. And so this like I think for me the major limitation of these models are they are trained on vast amount of data, and those data come from historical texts which might contain historical biases, limitations, and the model is learning that. So if I'm taught about something which has bias, I learn that bias. So how we can make the generated text more inclusive? So there is one aspect of research around LLMs is to make it more culturally aware. I don't. This might be very vastly different from what you just shared, but like I think still there is some amount of similarity here that like how two like humans and these AI models can coexist and help each other. So in concept, I'm working on one project which touches upon this a little bit. So in the context of education, that in the United States, where it's a diverse society, how can we produce lesson plans, educational contents, which can cater to specific cultures without denigrating others, or like how it can identify cultural biases or other kinds of biases, historical biases, and produce something which not only highlights that okay, this is biased information, but at the same time like mitigates that and produces something which is more acceptable. And I feel that like the topic for today was to how LLMs can lead to generation of robust AI models. I think this is definitely one aspect. Major limitation of LLMs include biases, and if we can address that, I think the interaction will be more seamless.
Any other comment? I mean, one of the things that Foy has looked at is also expand natural languages with logic and contracts and verification. So a robot interacting with humans has the job of figuring out what the conventions are. Maybe the cars drive on the right side here, and the drivers getting through here, and a bike lane should not go through there. And occasionally somebody walking could be walking a bike, and that's not following the rule for bike riding or for the rules for walking on the street. So how do we bring in a little bit of reasoning without making it too expensive into the system so that the robots recognize the conventions and understand what it is?
Yeah, and
And education also sometimes.
Sure. When you were talking about robots trying to figure out, okay, well, there's a person and they're an obstacle and I want to pass. What do I do? I think this idea of, okay, well, are there conventions that we can, as experts, give them, stay to the right or something like that? Those are great, right? And in the early days of AI, we had a lot of expert systems, but then of course, Hubert Dreyfus came and told us things like, no, that's not going to work. We actually do live in this kind of like hurly-burly of a Wittgensteinian world, and you need this kind of adaptive learning. But I'll tell you, when I'm in New York, mostly you can stick by this convention when you're walking on the sidewalk. You'll be on the right. But sometimes, because it's such a busy city, that doesn't happen. One person's going this way, another person's going that way, and you end up in this near collision with another person. So what I end up doing in those cases is I end up playing. I've ended up playing a repeated game. It's a repeated game of how can I, almost like prisoner's dilemma. How can I cooperate with this other person, even though I don't know if they're going to be cooperating with me? But I've also noticed that it's a bit of a signaling game. As I'm approaching this person that I might actually hit, is there something that I can do to indicate which way I'm going? And I have found, at least this is currently where I've learned, that if I signal with my arm just a little bit, diagonally, I tell the other party it's not foolproof that I'm going one way or another. And so I think this is a form of kind of like adaptive negotiation that happens kind of live as you're going, even though you're breaking the conventions. Here's what we're going to do. Let's do it. But yeah, to go back to what Bud was saying, we've been working on a language called Modality, and Modality is it's a specification language for coming to agreements, and these are evolving agreements. And it works by allowing you to state things as modal propositions, saying that, okay, well, if you go right, I'll go right, something like that. Or whenever you go right, I'll go right. And this is really interesting, because when we think about one-shot games, the strategy that we might get from a repeated game isn't necessarily the optimal one. But if we can transmit kind of ahead of time some rules back and forth to one another, we're actually able to establish that equilibrium from the repeated game as a one-shot game, which is just it's kind of miraculous. And of course, Bud, you've already mentioned this. It's something that in society we do this already. We create so many norms, we create rules, laws, etc. And there are ways of crafting environments in which, okay, well, hey, this is the way the game is played. If you break it, then it's costly, right? Something like that. So, yeah.
So this is like not an expert system creating guardrails. You are contributing to in a repeated game why there is a need for a guardrail and what the properties should be.
Yeah, exactly. And it goes back to what you did in the beginning of your career, which was formal systems and hardware verification, right? And so the magical thing about the languages used over there with hardware verification is that you get this modal logic that is seemingly perfect for playing these fictitious games in our minds between parties, so that we can arrive at the equilibrium of a repeated game in a one-shot game. And is that useful for humans? Yes, it's useful for humans, but I can imagine that it'd be greatly useful to other agents, automated agents like AI. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
again, I'm going to repeat the theme that we have many technologies, not just generative AI. We have logic, reasoning, game theory, and the optimistic way of thinking about that AI is that it'll bring everything together, not just say that humans are subsymbolic and I simulate a neuron or I do some association studies and put the conditional probabilities in a model language model structure, but recognize that humans are using a lot of techniques and technology together, and that's the way to be optimistic. Some of these technologies that seem necessary but very complex, from a complexity theory point of view, may need to be addressed. So I'm bringing up this idea that Inflexia wrote about. So one of the facts of the world we don't know is either P is equal to NP or P is not equal to NP. So how do we create our world in that uncertainty, right? I'm actually reading a book about click chemistry, and the author, who's got a Nobel Prize, Sharpless, keeps talking about certainty of chance. So there is chance, it's random, but it goes to some structure that arises. So the cooperation that we want between humans and bots and the conventions that we come up with could appear from very simple atomistic things, but with certainty, they create very strong reasoning systems. Does that make sense, or I confused you?
I think it keys into, well, one aspect of the paper, which is that, we try to look at our world and we notice that there is this laddering up of
Yeah.
systems, right? And sometimes we talked about it like, where does the symbolic world start? Does it start in biological systems, and how does it separate itself from some symbolic systems? And there's this cool, I think, sub-thesis of this paper, which is that there's something analogous about how all of these systems have arisen, and that if we can pull from one of the earlier ones, we can enhance the current ones that are running into states of contention. So, yeah.
Let's open up to the general audience, unless the panelist wants to say something. I'm a little unhappy that we don't have Petrina to talk about chemistry. I think that's going to be an amazing stuff. And there is, of course, things like AlphaFold 1, 2, and 3. And that shows that we can go a long way. But actually going the long way and creating drugs and self-driving cars, etc., should be done with an optimistic viewpoint, not worrying about existential threats or regulators or governments, etc., but by building that directly into the components of AI. And I like Foy's examples where the reasoning system, the Kripke structures, are hidden, but they evolve automatically, step by step, so that the conventions that arise are organic, so they are very logical and verifiable.
One question I have, unless we have questions from the audience, and I know it comes up in this paper, is are all the LLMs and other generative AIs we look at right now, is it all just Bayesian mimicry? And is there a way out of it simply being Bayesian mimicry? And for those who don't know, the idea of Bayesian mimicry is the idea that there's a species and it's slowly evolving to look like another model species that has some trait like being poisonous, and because it's poisonous, now the mimic isn't being eaten, right? So I often think about large language models as Bayesian mimics, and I wonder where the limit is. Like, is there a point at which we no longer consider it Bayesian mimicry, or shouldn't consider it Bayesian mimicry, or is there something else that we can add to it to make it more real?
Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah, I'm sorry, Tom.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to respond. So, see, knowledge bases or knowledge graphs equipped with large language models has the ability to perform complex reasoning like deduction, induction, analogy, and causality. And that's something I'm working on right now, like how large language models understands or interprets causality. And some early works have shown that it's not only okay, correct me if I understood your point wrong, that like it's not just like what it produces, what it understands, is based on what it was trained upon. It has the ability to do reasoning. So LLMs potentially they excel in natural language understanding, and that might not necessarily be exactly what it has been shown to during the training process. And they are good at inferring causal relationships. I have run experiments using multiple different large language models across using many different causality data sets, text-based causality data sets from different domains: finance, medicine, industrial engineering, etc. And it's a very good, it's quite good at identifying linguistic patterns indicative of causation, which were not shown to them. Implicit causality. Sometimes we mean causality, but we don't use any explicit markers like caused by, leads to. You can still identify those kind of implicit causality. And then on top of that, LLMs can be trained to perform causal reasoning tasks. Where they can predict the effectiveness of interventions or changes in variables within a causal model. That leads us to a very important aspect that counterfactuals, which is very important to determine causality. But from observational data, it's hard because you might not have that counterfactual world. But here, I think LLMs can play an important role, artificially creating that counterfactual world. Like LLMs can be, leveraged to perform counterfactual inference by generating hypothetical scenarios and evaluating their potential outcomes based on, causal knowledge encoded in their training data. So they don't know something about causality. Now you give the model a new scenario. It will be able to, generate that hypothetical world, the counterfactual world, and do counterfactual reasoning. Does that respond to your point?
It's very on point. I'm wondering, is that a system that's bolted on? Do you think that the causal reasoning needs to be bolted on, or is it something that you could just with enough examples of causal reasoning? It's
So like existing models already have that because they are trained on large amount of text, and on some of the text as scholarly articles, which has causal information, causal knowledge. So though it's a very nascent, it's a very new area of research. Direct application of LLMs into causality is relatively nascent. But I just would like to point it out to one paper by Jin et al. Called Do LLMs Infer Causation from Correlation? And they tested with 17 different large language models. And it's a year-old study. I don't know whether it evolved from there. And they found it's not a very, it's a promising start. But so right now, what they found that it's a very big shortcomings of LLMs that they cannot distinguish between correlation, association with causation. But with certain techniques like fine-tuning, domain-specific adaptation, LLMs should be capable of doing that.
Yeah.
that's
So what Foy is talking about is called cheap talk and Bayesian mimicry. But there is also Mullerian mimicry, which increases the cost, but doesn't have the problems of Bayesian mimicry. But Mullerian mimicry does lead to adversarial chase. So you come up with notion of causality, create a Mullerian mimicry, but then Bayesian mimicry try to mimic you with finite amount of structures, but mostly doing cheap talk. So what's the question is then, is there a technique to encourage Mullerian mimicry, but avoid Bayesian mimicry? And can that be done by creating good social conventions? Well, what you avoid, what you control by credible threats, non-credible threats, etc. I mean, I didn't want to bring up, but I'm looking at a law court in Manhattan, going through similar questions, right? Was the law violated because somebody paid somebody money, or because he violated the conventions in which you annotate the information, not by verbal things, not by phone recording, but by drop-down menu and checking things. So there's clearly what's going on is a choice of conventions that distinguishes Mullerian mimicry from Bayesian mimicry. It doesn't want to stop good people who are doing invoice and paying money, but somebody doing it in a cheap talk to hide something. So I think in addition to Mullerian mimicry, one needs to provide techniques for others to distinguish them. Right.
yeah, to get some kind of
adversarial chase. Yeah, adversarial chase can be very expensive. And you see that in mate selection. Basically, a species can go extinct trying to be superior in a mate selection by display. It's like peacocks or antlers, right?
I wonder though if AI, the developments in AI over the past, we'll say since 2012, the emphasis has been on making Bayesian mimicry more tractable, right? Like, I mean, with the beginning of
we can't
convolutional
prove
neural,
that.
yes,
We can't prove that that's the case, but
Well,
that question has come up over and over.
yeah,
Is it cheap talk or is it giving a reasoning system? And I think what Sunandan is saying, that you can do Mullerian mimicry and prove that you are doing Mullerian mimicry, either through a zero knowledge proof or one-way function or identity, public key identity or something, so that Mullerian mimicry can be distinguished from Bayesian mimicry, and it becomes a property of separating equilibrium. And we are not anywhere close to that, but there is a possibility. That's why I am optimistic. Yeah, my friend Daniela Rus just published something about whales talking to each other by clicks. And do they do costly signaling? Do they do credible threat? So, but it is still possible, right?
Yeah. So Nadan, going back to what you were saying, I'd love to. I haven't done this yet, but now it's come to mind. I'd love to throw Newcomb's paradox, if you guys know what that is. Newcomb's paradox at one of these large language models to see one of these supposedly causal large language models to see if it thinks causally or if it's an evidentialist. But Yeah, that would be a fascinating thing.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
How are we doing the time? We're almost up.
It's 10:02 a.m. where I am.
Yeah. Yeah, should we take some questions and wrap up in 10, 15 minutes? I don't see any questions. Yeah, so we should wrap up in a minute or two. Should we repeat this? Was it organizationally interesting or? Yeah, one of the other things that I liked about Ishiharu's idea is a lot of the discussions about the kind of questions that Sunandan was bringing up, or Foy was bringing up, they are being done on social media. And there are people who have taken up the role of a supporter or a detractor. And we miss the kind of academic or deeper discussions that should be available, like the ones we talked about today. I don't see that on LinkedIn or Facebook or Meta. And they're not going to do it anyway because they have fiduciary duties to the shareholders and they take certain positions, and some others who are detractors, they have also taken up a role. So something that can be done in a peer-reviewed journal should also be thought through, and maybe invite to these meetings interesting people. I was hoping that Brian Scarms would join, and he was interested. He read the paper, asked questions, but he didn't want to wake up at 5 in the morning. He said he would be useless with us. And Petrina or Alex will not join. And drug discovery is a very important area for large language models. I mean, all our drones, education, and but it would be good to invite people to take a scholarly role in figuring out what AI should do. And AI has never really done that. For the last 3 years or so that I've known AI, it's always been very informal and attacks and counterattacks. So I congratulate Ishiharu for organizing such a journal, and Rick Lee, who is not here, could help us in attracting good scholarly articles that asks questions that cannot be asked in a blog post on LinkedIn.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you.
Should we leave?
Yes, it was a pleasure chatting, everyone.
Yes, it was nice meeting you all, and thanks, Bud, for bringing us together. It was a very nice and eclectic group. I would love to follow up.
Yeah, we should work together. It's good to create a community and collaborate, write grant proposals, start companies, whatever we can do to, I mean, if we don't come up with a drug that can help people because we don't like large language models, that would be a loss. We don't want to be frozen by so-called existential threat in order not to take advantage of what's there. But we should be cautious because we have to understand that these are issues that remain.
All right, we'll stay optimistic.
Okay.
Let's see everyone.
See you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye.